Alrighty, so question number 1. Americans don't have a difficulty saying the proper names for private body parts out loud. Why do you think this is? Well, America was founded on highly religious principles, specifically Christian doctrines, which, and its origin, and the origin of our country, already painted an idea of sexual conservatism and its stigmatization of sexual language or sex. It was mainly seen as a holy practice between a man and a woman under the eye of God, and I mean, obviously not everyone shared those ideas when this country was being formed, but those are the ideas that founded this country, and that's where we all kind of came from as a country, so it only makes sense that those doctrines and ideas would permeate throughout the ages into our modern society, specifically if no steps are being made to counteract them or to work with them into making our society better, which really there hasn't been. Well, that's not true. There obviously has been, but not to the degree that is needed to fully counteract it, right? There's been sexual revolutions. There's been hundreds of thousands of talks about destigmatizing sex. The idea of sex is slowly becoming more and more destigmatized, but there's still a ways to go. Also, because of those doctrines, America has been a highly conservative country, not only because of the doctrines, but because of the people who choose to promote those doctrines, like our former presidents, senators, group leaders, local activists. There has been a trend for conservatism in every imaginable way, specifically in sexuality as well. We do seem to have a trend between God and a lot of our more conservative presidents. I know Reagan was really big into, one of our most conservative presidents, Reagan, was really, really big into religion, both he and Nancy. And then look at our our current president, Trump, who will not constantly, but he'll regularly bring up religion and God in these more political situations. Also, there is this idea of gender standards when it comes to how you carry yourself and how polite or prim and proper you are. For example, a few decades ago, and even today, it's still seen as improper for women to have conversations openly about sex. It's a little bit less stigmatized for men, just because of that double standard, but still there's certain people that you wouldn't say it around. And I think what really needs to happen is for people to start walking away from that, realizing that this is just a natural thing that happens and that it's a part of the human situation, part of the human circumstance, part of the human experience that is entirely natural and needs to be worked towards being destigmatized. Let me make sure I went over everything. I think we are good. Okay, question number 2. How do you think the first article and the NPR story are related? Well, the two of them talk about the effects of a negative... Let me say that one more time. The two of them talk about the negative outcomes of a lack of proper sexual education. So if we look at the interview from NPR first, right? They talk about how a lack of sexual education, specifically towards these young men, or young men in general, causes issues like toxic masculinity, rape, body and gender standards getting way out of control. They talk about how a lot of young men are brought up into society, where media specifically, just because it's one of the most marketable things that you can do, and it seems to permeate a little bit faster through our country than more experimental or less conservative ideas. That men are supposed to be these big, tough, burly guys who do what they want, when they want, with who they want, and that the most manly thing that you can do is to try and emulate that. Or in this circumstance, one of the things that one of the interviewers brought up, I believe Malik, said that a lot of men see that the most manly thing that you can do is to take a woman, which obviously isn't true, but unfortunately the way our society is painting it, that is kind of this masculine fantasy that can be counteracted by conversations with people with like the proper sexual education training, or with the right mindset to help people, specifically young men, get away from that toxic masculinity. Let me make sure I touch on everything for that before I move on. Alrighty. And then the article talks about the stigmatization of sexual language, specifically with our private body parts or genitalia, and its effect in our society, and how that can be counteracted with proper sexual education and conversations that destigmatize sex and sexual reproductive organs as well. They give great examples about a young kindergartner being pulled from class by her mom because apparently the school's sex ed program was, what was the word they're looking for? It stole away her innocence, right? Or the representative from Michigan who got pulled out of the House of Representatives because she used the word vagina when talking about an abortion debate. And it seems ridiculous, but there are people who obviously care very much about these conservative values that would counteract people saying these or people teaching these. Like in the case of the representative, if you looked at the article, the initial article that was tagged or linked on the one that we read, there was a list of comments from Republican representatives who refused to repeat what she said, as if it was the worst thing possible. And they made a huge deal about how disgusting it was that this woman said the word vagina in a place of politics. And so, yeah, just to kind of tie everything back together, both of those stories talk about the issues of sexuality in our country, but they also give an answer to those problems through the world of sexual education and how opening these conversations and destigmatizing sex can help us move in the right direction. Now then, the final question. What can society do to change this? Will changing it stem into any other social issues? Why or why not? Well, going back to the second question, and their answer for how to fix it, just bettering our sexual education is a great place to start. And we can do that through looking back at curriculums, as well as looking at the legislation of certain states, specifically Arizona, who has a terrible mentality when it comes to sexual education. My stepmom is a social worker, and she has had many experiences where she's shown up to schools to talk to young kids about sex ed and talk about like healthy relationships and consent, and having faculty members or the principal or some other higher up come up to her and ask her if she can refrain from using the word sex in these conversations, which is ridiculous. We shouldn't be forced to hold sexual education to such a conservative and restrained standard, specifically because it's a natural thing. Like I said earlier, it's a concept and it's an act that is highly important and permeates throughout the human experience. So it would only make sense that we destigmatize it and kind of desexualize sex in a way. Going back to legislation, voting in proper lawmakers who share the same ideals about sex ed and sexual education, as well as like issues like rape and toxic masculinity, is another great way to step into this and to fix this issue. And then kind of the second half of this question is asking, will changing this stem into any other social issues? I think it will, specifically if we start having these conversations between young men and women about these traditional values that don't really work in our society anymore. I think one of the biggest changes we'll see in a social issue is with gender standards and kind of these double standards that men and women are both held to. The fact that men are able to talk about sex freely without being stigmatized or ridiculed, but if women do it, they're looked down upon and called horrible names. I mean, that's just one issue. Another issue to look at it again that ties into this is like toxic masculinity, getting men, specifically young men, away from these horrible ideals of what a man should be and what they actually should be emulating is just a good person, as well as body issues, right? Being more comfortable with your body, getting away from these high beauty standards that are caused by these machismo or overtly sexual feminine roles in media, I think will change if this idea of sexual education, which ties into body acceptance, relationship work, as well as a comfortability with yourself as who you are, will change. And I think that's all the time and the things I wanted to say. I'm looking forward to your responses to this, and thank you for watching. I appreciate it.